On behalf of the foundation, I would like to thank our co-sponsors of the program this evening, the Friends of the Walnut Creek Library, the East Bay Times, and Minuteman Press. We're grateful for their support that allows us to bring programs like this to the library. We are also grateful to all of you for your support of the Walnut Creek and the Ignacio Valley Libraries. We just came off our fabulous Wonderland Gala last month, and I see many of you in the audience who were at the gala. We also have another opportunity for you to support the library with fellow library lovers. On September 10th, we are going to have an evening called Mockingbird Magic at the home of Dick and Sally Ingram on Mockingbird Hill. And it'll be an evening where we have wine, food, beautiful views of Mount Diablo, and another way for you to support the library. There's information out at the front desk on how to purchase tickets for that event, and we hope to see some of you there. So now, Little Women. We all probably, or many of us, I should say, probably read Little Women when we were much younger for the first time, and perhaps we've read it again in later years in our book clubs or just on our own. We've probably seen the screen adaptations. Who's watched Little Women just recently on Masterpiece? And if any of you watched PBS's Great American Read last night, you'll know that Little Women is on the list of the 100 books for the best loved novel in America.
Vote for it.
So we're here tonight with a panel of scholars who are here for the American Literature Association conference in San Francisco. We're so fortunate that they came out to Walnut Creek this evening to talk with us about Little Women, why it endures in our hearts and our imagination, and what makes this book relevant 150 years after its publication. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our panel. We have Ann Phillips and Gregory Eislein from Kansas State University. We have Sandra Harbert Petrolinas from Penn State Altoona. Marlo Daly Galliano from Lewis Clark State College in Idaho. Christine Doyle, who is at Central Connecticut University. And Melissa McFarland Pennell, who is at University of Massachusetts Lowell. So with that, I will turn it over to Ann and our panel. Thank you for coming this evening.
Sandy's going to be our first speaker this evening.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Can you hear me in the back? Am I all right? Before what my esteemed colleagues and friends here talk to you about Little Women, the book, I want to talk to you a little bit about Little Women, the person, Little Woman, the person, Louisa May Alcott, and especially the town of Concord where she lived, because even though the family moved over 30 times in the adult woman's life, most of what we think about Louisa is centered in the very famous historic town of Concord, Massachusetts, where she had some famous neighbors who were also writers, and I bet you've heard of a few of them. The images here are two of the homes that get the most attention for the Alcott's residences in Concord. It is actually the yellow home here where she lived with her sisters as the little girl. The romps, the games, the theatricals were really in this home. But Orchard House is where they lived when they moved back to Concord in 1858. So the yellow home they lived in, I believe, and I may get corrected here somewhere along the line, from 45 to 48. They had lived in Concord also from 40 to 43. 1840 to 43 in another home, but Orchard House was really the home where they invested a lot of their time and love and where Little Women was written. Her parents, as I said, moved frequently, so in her adult life, once Louisa made the success as a writer that she did, she bought a home in Boston and they lived there as well. But she ended up purchasing the home of the Thoreau family, Henry Thoreau's family, and for her parents as well, but I don't have that image up there. This yellow house, before I move on to the other images, I just want to put the attention there that it's due. It's the only structure in Concord, Massachusetts that actually has the designation as the Underground Railroad stop. There are other homes that are known to have been used in that way as well, but they're privately owned, and those owners have not gone through the paperwork and done what needs to be done to get that designation. So if you have the chance to visit Concord, it's well worth your time to go through that. Louisa May Alcott had conflicted attitudes. As much as Concord is idealized as this charming childhood place and town and full of exciting places to venture and skate and have lots of friends, she was conflicted about it, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that. So Concord was the happiest time of her life. It was also a time where people were provincial and small-minded, and where the Alcott girls were not always encouraged. And I think we see that in Little Women from time to time. Certainly, two of her most famous friends and friends of the family, and certainly a benefactor financially of the family as well, Ralph Waldo Emerson. So Henry Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Louisa adored. Both as a girl growing up, she and Emerson's daughters would go to Walden with other young people, and Henry Thoreau would take them around the pond, and they would go on huckleberrying adventures and things like that together. So on the one hand, Waldo gets her esteem as sort of a more godly, philosophical figure, certainly more fatherly. Henry Thoreau, I think she thought of as an older brother, and possibly a romantic interest, a girl's crush at some points in her life as well. Her deepest affection, I would say, was reserved for Thoreau. And her poem, Thoreau's Flute, was elegized him when he died and was published in the anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. And so we think of her for that as well. But Concord was far more than these two famous men. It was filled with women who were activists and reformers, and like her mother, Louisa May Alcott, was very committed to social reform. And so in that effort, she worked with these women quite often, particularly in the anti-slavery effort. That effort was central to all that went on in the Boston-Concord area. Frederick Douglass, Lewis Hayden, Harriet Tubman, and others came through this town. There were radical meetings on the topic of anti-slavery. By the 1840s, the churches had closed their doors to the anti-slavery women, and speakers were not allowed to talk about that subject from the church pulpits any longer. Harriet Tubman actually came back to Concord quite often during the Civil War. During one point when she visited the town in 1863, she was there to raise money and to collect clothing for freed communities of people in New York and Canada. And Abigail Alcott, Louisa's mother, helped her in that clothing effort and was reminded of the amount of racism that still existed in Concord even as the war raged on, because she was called names when it became clear to people why she was there to collect the clothing. Louisa and her family, as I said, moved back to Concord in 1858, at which time the anti-slavery movement was really in its, what we would call, the most turbulent, almost militant phase before the war broke out in 1861. And Louisa immediately started contributing amateur theatricals, writing little dramas. I shouldn't call them little because they involved many of the people in the community. But you can see from just one letter that Anna, her sister, Anna Alcott, wrote to her father, who was out of town at the time, that again, the Alcott girls were regarded as the upstart radicals, and many of the other young women in the community didn't want anything to do with this particular cause. When John Brown came to town, obviously, for those of you who know something about John Brown and the raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859, things got yet more radical. He came to Concord in March 1857, again in May 1859, raising money, especially in May 1859, for the Harper's Ferry raid that took place just 5 months later. John Brown was certainly entertained, welcomed. He gave speeches. Bronson went to hear him, as well as Thoreau and Emerson, and the entire Alcott family was very supportive. after Harper's Ferry, Louisa's letters, Amy's, I say Amy from Little Women, her sister May's letters, they make it very clear that the family is upset, supportive, absolutely no doubt at all that what John Brown had done was probably going to be the spark that moved us closer to the Civil War. And this is just one example of many letters that Louisa wrote at this time about that subject. By the end of 1859, this is Abigail Alcott, she has some really poignant journal entries where she's assessing the meaning of John Brown's legacy. And I find this one really interesting, that his martyrdom has perhaps been the event of 1859, that the hour and the man both came at last to reveal to the South their sins and to the slaves their savior. He came to them with a sword, but he has slain thousands by his word. I mean, Abigail Alcott does not get enough credit for being one of the fabulous writers of the family. And then I'll just leave you with one of my favorite things to tell students about Louisa May Alcott, especially as we are all working our way toward Memorial Day holiday. When you are at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord and you go to this famous Author's Ridge where you have many nice granite plaques directing you to, and you see the famous graves of Hawthorne and Emerson and Thoreau, and you're standing there and you're all excited, it's this grave that gets the American flag, because it's this American author on Author's Ridge that had Civil War service as a nurse. So I'll leave you with that. We can certainly cover during the Q&A any questions that might come up about any of those topics. So move on to Chris.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some things we didn't know about her back in that day. We are, of course, celebrating 150 years of Little Women this year. This is a book that has never been out of print since it was first published. But as Sandy was mentioning, the constricting values in Concord, when Louisa read the Scarlet Letter, she wrote in her journal in 1850, "I fancy lurid things if they're true and strong also." And she said to an interviewer later in her life that she felt that her real taste for writing was for the more lurid stories, but the chain armor of propriety, isn't that how she said it, in Concord, kept her from doing too much of that. But we know she did do some of that, because even if you read in Little Women, when Joe enters a story in a contest and wins $100 for it, that Louisa May Alcott sent a story to Frank Leslie's newspaper called Pauline's Passion and Punishment, and she won $100 for that. Later in the book, in the chapter that is called Friend, when Joe is in New York, and she is writing to make a little bit of extra money and taking stories to a Mr. Dashwood at the Weekly Volcano. And she mentions how she won this prize in the Blarney Stone Banner, and she sells her stories until she gets very uncomfortable about those kinds of stories. So we knew those were out there, but her first biographer, Edna Cheney, really minimized that sort of thing when she published the biography shortly after Alcott had died, and presented and promoted her as the children's friend. And so a lot of this other kind of writing that she was doing was lost for quite a long time. Her journals, because she kept a list at the end of each month about things that she had sold and for how much. You should look at the complete journal sometimes. It's kind of interesting. We know she was writing those kind of stories as early as 1858. Some of those, they were in the story papers, and some of them were just not around anymore, and they were published either anonymously or under pseudonyms, and so nobody even knew. You could have read that, and you could have not even known that it was an Alcott story. And then came, these are our heroes, Madeleine Stern and Leona Rostenberg, who for a long, long period of time in the 20th century were very close friends and business partners in a rare books company. So their business was to look for old and unpublished things, and Madeleine was working on a biography of Alcott, and this was in 1943. They were working in the Houghton Library at Harvard and came across some letters from 1865 from the publisher of The Flag of Our Union, whose name was James Eliot. And the letter is from Eliot, and it says, "You may send me anything that you do not wish to father, or that you wish A.M. Barnard or any other man to be responsible for, and if they suit me, I will purchase them." So they had a name, A.M. Barnard, and they had a publisher. Unfortunately, this isn't during the middle of the Second World War. The Library of Congress, and I still don't understand why this is, but had locked up all the existing copies of some of these old newspapers, so they were not available to Madeleine and Leona at the time. But they did go back and start going through them when they were available again. And out of this, there are now 30 of these thriller or potboiler, or sometimes she called them her blood and thunder stories that they have recovered and republished. And we see in these stories her real attraction, I think, because Frank Leslie, who was the other one who published a lot of these, was actually British in origin, and the British version of those kinds of stories are a bit racier than the American ones were. There's been a lot of work done on this, but there's some of the things that they did, and I think you could appreciate her interest and her practicing the kind of character studies. They focused on women characters. They centralized women characters, and not just women who were home raising families, but adventurous kinds of women, actors, people out in the world and doing all kinds of, I mean, there's a perilous play, they're all doing hashish, and I mean, these are really wild stories. If you've never read them, Behind the Mask is just a fabulous story, probably the most best written one of any of them. And the ones that are the best of them came right before Little Women, 1866, 1867. They put women as central characters, and they also, a lot of them had their wild stories, but also made social commentary at the same time, the British forms of these. And so you can see why she would be so interested in them. So we now have a whole collection, about 30 of those stories that help us reflect back on Little Women and the kind of dynamic characters that she created, and especially Jo March, who will probably live forever for many of us. And then the one that I got personally more connected with, a story that had never been published. It was sitting also at the Houghton Library in their special collections in a manuscript. She wrote this story at about that same time as well, and sent it to Mr. James Eliot, who sent it back saying it was, quote, too long and too sensational. And so she just put it on a shelf and never did anything. There are some marks on it. Yeah, that was my scholarly thrill. I went up there to read it, and they plunked this book in front of me. That was her manuscript for this book. She touched these pages. Right? Took me half an hour just to even open it and do it. But I worked with it when I wrote my dissertation, and then after that. It went on the open market, and a fellow who was actually a school principal at a New Hampshire high school that is built around largely Bronson Alcott's educational theories, he bought it, and it was published as A Long Fatal Love Chase. And it is, this is a story about a woman who is tending her elderly grandfather who doesn't appreciate it, and she says, I would sell my soul to get out of here, and knock, 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 Philip Tempest at the door, who sweeps her off and marries her without mentioning that he's already married. And when she finds this out, she runs away from him, and he chases her all over Europe. It is quite a wild story. But this book, this was published in 1995. Louisa May Alcott had a new bestseller in 1995. It was reviewed in the New York Times by Stephen King, who did a wonderful appreciation of it, and it was translated into other languages and sold all over the world. This is the last picture I have for you. In England, it was published as The Chase, and there's all this kind of filtered thing. And that thing on the right side is the Dutch cover. And as many times as I have read Long Fatal Love Chase, I don't know where that scene is in this book. It's wild, but it's not that wild. But I think it's wonderful that after more than 100 years after she died, she had a new bestseller. Okay, Greg, it's all yours.
Thank you. I did not read Little Women as a kid. In fact, I had read, when I was a graduate student, I was reading these and her nonfiction and some other things before I read Little Women. And so I was primed when I read Little Women it was a very dark book for me. And it was the raciness of these thrillers I just saw on every page of Little Women. Little Women's interesting because it is both a book that's beloved, and in the 19th century, it was beloved by a wide range of people. It's often considered or talked about as a girl's book now, and it was in the 19th century as well. But there were lots and lots of boy and male readers, including Teddy Roosevelt, who, for instance, who loved the whole series and talked about them as really wholesome books, and they are really wholesome books. He worshipped them. If Anne interrupts me, we do research together, and so we often are on the same wavelength.
He's promised he's going to interrupt me too, so it's okay.
Is anyone here read YA novels? See some hands. The Harry Potters. A lot of people. The Hunger Games. The Hate You Give. The John Green novels. Things like they're all over the bestsellers. And for me, it's because of Alcott. Before Louisa May Alcott, children's literature is dismal. It is. I would love to make it more nuanced and complicated than that, but it's not really. It's dismal. The stories are, the really bad ones are like kids go do naughty things where they don't obey their parents, and then they wander into the woods and get eaten by a bear. And I'm not exaggerating. Even the really good stuff before Alcott that features child protagonists. I love Dickens, and Old Curiosity Shop has this great character, Nell, or Uncle Tom's Cabin has little Ava. These are fantastic characters, but they're not of this world. I mean, they don't do bad things. They don't have childhood impulses. They are saintly. They are angels here on earth. this changes after Alcott, and not all at once. I mean, the other big bestseller around Alcott's time is a book series known as Elsie Dinsmore. Did anybody read these or know these? Yeah, they're not as famous.
There were a lot of Elsie books. Dozens.
Elsie's, they're miserable. It's just this constant self-denial and punishment, like extreme punishments for doing little things that are wrong, and they're not fun.
Can I talk about the piano scene?
Please.
Okay, so Elsie's father is very hard-hearted, and he invites his friends over on a Sunday, and he insists that she play the piano for the friends, but it's Sunday, so she can't because she's an angel on earth. And so she sits at that piano, she's on the bench, and she refuses to play until she passes out and falls over and hits her head, and there's blood everywhere. And this is the moment that starts to convince her father that maybe he needs to change his ways and be a better person. That's like the liveliest moment in Elsie's life.
And so when Little Women comes around, all of a sudden you get this story about these four sisters and the boy next door, that they go do fun stuff. They do theatricals together. They play. They go on picnics. They do outdoor sports. They play card games. I mean, the book is fun. There are moments of moralizing, and this isn't my point, but I think the moments of moralizing to me are really important. They're often about anger's not going to get you anywhere, which is something I think. But a lot of the moralizing, one of my favorites, okay. So you know the story, the part where Amy gets caught with the contraband pickled limes? She has to throw them out the window, and she gets her hand slapped. And as this part of Little Women, Marmee teaches each one of the daughters a lesson. And Jo learns to control her anger, and her anger was almost lethal. With Amy, I wrote down the quote so I wouldn't get it wrong. When Marmee kind of gives Amy a chance to talk about what she learned, Amy says, well, it's nice to have accomplishments and be elegant, but not to show off. And it's like, no, Amy, that's not really the lesson you just learned at all. And the book kind of points out that Amy has ethical limitations. She's a kid. And the real moral, I think, of that chapter is that Mr. Davis's corporal punishment is not okay. It's not okay to hit little girls because they broke a rule. So the play, I think, is important. I think another reason the book is really important is it alters significantly the conventional family story. One thing that's interesting but odd about it is Mr. March is hardly there. And so it becomes very much a story about the four sisters and their mom. And these relationships between the sisters, they're all so different from each other. And for me, one of the things I love about this book and talking about it with students is that it reminds readers that there's all kinds of different ways to be a little woman or to be a person and to grow up. There's not one kind of femininity. There's not one kind of masculinity. There's not one way to be somebody. For me, Marmee is one of my favorite characters. And there's a belief, I've read this in criticism sometimes, that, well, Marmee's kind of conventional, this good mother dispensing moralistic wisdom. What's actually really interesting about most literature and the representation of moms is that they're evil, or they're funny and laughable and need to get gotten away with. I would argue that the dominant trend in literary works from Medea through Hamlet to Pride and Prejudice to the present is that moms are either funny and kind of stupid, Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, or they're evil. My 2.5-year-old is obsessed with Hansel and Gretel. That's this one mean stepmom, right? She's and Marmee's not. Marmee is not, and it's one of the things I love about the book. The intensity of the relationship between the sisters seems to mirror the family. And one of my favorite and I think oddest moments in the book is the first wedding Meg gets married to John. And the minister, which is Mr. March, says, you can kiss your husband now. You may kiss the bride. She says, no, I got to save my first kiss for Marmee. That's odd, right? But I think so the book is not conventional in the way that it represents, but it's not negative. The moms aren't these mean stereotypes that the girls get to grow up against. In fact, the mother is somebody who's encouraging them to develop in these very different ways. I think that's important. I'll hurry here. It disrupts our sense of gender. I mean, you probably all know Jo's a tomboy, right? She's very masculine. She whistles. She likes to play all the male parts in the theatricals. She uses slang and loves it. She wishes that she had been born a boy, and she wants to go off to the war and fight. Laurie is the boy with a girl's name. Laurie is portrayed as sentimental. He's very emotional. Those of you who saw the BBC version, I thought they did a great job with portraying Laurie as this emotional kid. And you know what? There are some teenage boys that get emotional about these things. And Alcott wanted to capture that, I think, in her presentation of Laurie. Even Amy, who is sometimes in the criticism and sometimes by readers seen as very traditionally feminine. And those of us who love Jo, it often takes us a while to get to love Amy because she burns the book, right? Yeah. And it was years. Anne and I talked about this for years. I could not forgive Amy. I just how could you do that to her book? And then it was a critic, it was Elizabeth Kaiser, who reminded me that in a lot of ways, Amy might be the feminist character in the book. We often think it's Jo, but Amy's the one that gets everything she wants. and part of Elizabeth Kaiser's point is, isn't that one part of what feminism is about? Is that maybe women should get what they want. So she gets the trip to Europe, and she gets Laurie, and she gets a lot of money, and she doesn't suffer that much. And I think Amy is really interesting. The marriage plot is topsy-turvy. If you read part 1 of this, everybody back then and now expects and wants Jo and Laurie to get married. Alcott won't do that for us. I think she knew all along that would never happen, that she didn't really struggle with that one. But what she did struggle with is, should she marry Professor Bear, or should she stay, spinster. I didn't want to use that word, but it's the word she uses, right? An old maid. And so I think it's interesting that she disrupts the marriage plot. The book continues to be really important to people. Some of my quick examples, the number of people who are fans of Little Women is diverse and long. I'm going to just read some of them to you. Sandra Day O'Connor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Laura Bush, and Hillary Clinton. One of my favorites, as they know, is the rock star, Patti Smith. And Sandy was just telling me that Patti Smith's daughter, Jessie, is a member of our society. I didn't know that until right now. I'm thrilled. I like rock and roll.
And Patti Smith she's written the introduction to Anne Boyd Rue's new book about Little Women, or the new edition of Little Women. Which is awesome. The number of writers is impressive. Stephen King was mentioned, Gertrude Stein, Ursula Le Guin, J.K. Rowling. This is my only quote here. Is Rowling said about the book, "My favorite literary heroine is Jo March. It is hard to overstate what she meant to a small, plain girl called Jo, who had a hot temper and a burning ambition to be a writer." As Chris pointed out, scholars didn't really talk about Alcott. In the 40s, Leona Rostenberg and Madeleine Stern made some important discoveries, but most of when academic critics in the 19th and 20th century will mention Alcott, it's dismissive.
this starts to change in the 70s and then the 80s, and then in the 90s, I think it just kind of explodes, the criticism. The other thing I would point out is the number of spin-offs and adaptations from the 1933, which is not the first, but it's one of the famous ones with Katharine Hepburn as Jo, the 1994 Winona Ryder. There's a whole bunch. There's one coming out that we're going to talk about, the mini-series. There's a graphic novel that's being released right now called, has anybody seen it? They live in Brooklyn. It's called Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, but it's a graphic novel, modernized version. There's an opera. There's some mashups, Little Vampire Women and Little Women and Werewolves. There's fan fiction sites. There's a YouTube series called The March Family Letters. This is one of the things I want to talk about at some point, but I think this is one of the stories of American literature, this kind of quartet of girls becoming women who've got 4 very different personalities. And once you realize, like, oh, this is a story, this is a kind of structure that many people have used since Alcott, you see it everywhere. Some example, HBO's Girls, Showtime's Sex and the City, The Facts of Life, Designing Women, Golden Girls, Petticoat Junction, I'm not sure about. But I think maybe, Desperate Housewives. And as Chris and some others have mentioned, it continues to be on these best ever kind of books. And 150 years later, that a lot of people say, no, this is my favorite book ever, I think kind of testifies to its enduring significance. And I'll turn it over.
And hang on, because I'm going to add just a couple little things. So I want to tell you just briefly about the manuscript, the text of Little Women. And I'll have a little exercise for you to go home and do when I'm done. So when Alcott wrote Little Women, it came out in October of 1868, and she had been asked by a publisher in Boston to write a book for girls because there were books for boys that were selling very well, and so the publisher said, we think you should write a book about girls. And at first she's like, well, you know, I don't really know very many girls and I didn't really like very many girls, but okay, fine, whatever. And there's other possible reasons why she was coerced into writing this, but she gets interested in the project, she starts writing it, and she starts thinking about her own family's history and their experiences, and she's much more enthusiastic about what she's written by the time it comes out. So don't just take that, oh, I didn't like girls very much, and leave it there, because she didn't leave it there. She grew from that position. But so it comes out in October. Immediately it's a bestseller. Immediately she's getting letters galore and commentaries from everybody who knows her about what's going to happen to these characters. You have to tell us more of the story about these characters. And so November 1st, she starts writing the second part of their story. She finishes it by January 1st. It comes out in April of 1869, which is why this 150th anniversary of Little Women actually starts this year and spans into next year. But so for years then, there were like 2 volumes of the story of Little Women. And they were sold, you know, with similar bindings. You could buy the 2 parts, you know, and they were, and I have seen, by the way, Emily Dickinson's sister's copy of Little Women, and I have seen Sarah Orne Jewett's sister's copy of Little Women, and we wonder about whether they had sisters who wanted to burn their books, but anyways. So for about 10 years, the books were sold. You could buy each part separately. Okay. In 1880, the book company puts out a 1-volume version where they put them together, they, you know, number the chapters consecutively, and a funny thing happened. Some of the text changed. And that version of the text is cleaned up, it's more grammatically correct, it's sort of aiming more towards conventional, at least middle class sort of approval. And I think that Alcott was criticized for bad grammar and what Edith Wharton called the laxities of the great Louisa, because she was being a snob. There, you have it. And Alcott didn't make those changes. Somebody at the book company made those changes. But here's the thing, if you read Little Women anywhere in the 20th century up until maybe almost the mid-1980s, the version you read was the cleaned up version. And I'm going to give you just a couple of different examples of how it was changed. In the very first chapter of Little Women, the girls are talking about, you know, Christmas won't be Christmas without presents, and they're talking about the Christmas theatricals and so on and so forth. And Jo was talking about how irritating it is to her to have to go help Aunt March every day. And she says, that she gets so frustrated about it that it just makes her, Jo, want to box Aunt March's ears. And that's, like whap, 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 right? That's like a violent animated image. It was revised that it just makes her want to cry. Her, Jo, want to cry. There's a world of difference between Jo who wants to box the ears and Jo who wants to cry. In the original text, Marmee's not terribly attractive, but she's a fabulous mother and they love her. That's where the energy is centered. In the revised version, she's suddenly a noble-looking woman. That's a direct quote. Laurie is the same age as Jo in the original version, and he's much more Italian and ethnic. He's got a big nose and, dark skin. And by the time they clean him up for the later version, he's older, taller, more handsome. What a beautiful nose, yada, 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 okay? Jo's full of Dickens Wellerisms all the way through the first edition, and they take some of those out. There's also, so this is if you have a copy of Little Women, I want you to go home tonight. I want you to look at the first chapter, and in the first 2 pages, Jo, first of all, is saying, I'm sure we grub hard enough to earn some rewards. If it's grub, you've got a first edition version. If it's we work hard enough, you have a revised version. And the other one that I always go to, like if I'm in a bookstore or a student brings, her mother's copy to me and says, look at this, what do you know about this? I immediately go and look to see if Jo is examining the heels of her boots in a gentlemanly fashion, or she's examining the heels of her shoes. The shoes are the revised ones, and it makes her less tomboyish, right? But I am always so happy when the version they bring me says that she's examining the heels of her boots in a gentlemanly fashion. So that's your assignment for tonight, is to check your copies. So take it away, Melissa.
Gosh, well, I'm not sure I can come up with anything that is as interesting as all of that. Unlike I think most of the other panelists up here, did not read Little Women until I had finished graduate school. And it was actually the second book by Alcott that I read, because the first book by her that I read was a novel called Work, which is a book that she wrote for really adult readers. And that follows the career of a young woman named Christy Devon, who has to make her way in the world. But as I was thinking about this panel and about the way that I have reacted to things in Little Women, one of the things that really struck me about the novel is the way that Alcott, throughout the book, is presenting us images of women working. And I think that, too, speaks to a lot of women's experiences today, that there is really a tremendous range of work that women do. And some of that work is seen out in the public sphere and is noticed by everyone. But there's still lots of work that women do that tends to be, as I was sharing with a few of my colleagues, invisible. And I think that part of what Alcott does in Little Women that makes that a book that speaks to us as adult readers as well is talk about a lot of that invisible work. And one of the things that made me think about using that term for it was that I started trying to find images to show you of 19th century women's work. And it's very difficult to find them. And so I only have a couple of photographs to show you. And one is of a group of working women that Alcott would not herself have really been very enthusiastic about, because as some of you may know, the one area of work for women that she does not talk about in her fiction is going into the factories to work. And yet, when her family was dealing with desperate poverty at times, and they were living in Concord, Lowell, Massachusetts is 12 miles up the road. And it was full of textile mills that were employing young women who lived in boarding houses together and often went to work in those mills with other family members, so that sometimes sisters or cousins, or at least young women from the same town, all moved up to Lowell and lived in the same boarding house together. And so they also had sisterly relationships at times, but it was a kind of work that Louisa herself just could not bring herself to endorse. And I think it's partly because she feared that there would be a loss of individuality, that if you became attached to a machine, your individual self would start to be erased. And so I'm going to see if I can do this.
You gotta go past mine.
Oh, nope, heading the wrong way. Sorry about that. So I just thought you would like to see a photograph of some of those young women who were working in the mills in the 19th century. And this is actually a photograph from Lowell. By the time that Little Women is being published, changes are happening actually in most of the textile mills in New England, and increasingly young women are no longer the primary workforce in those mills. But it's fun to have this image to look at. In Louisa's own life, she was actually surrounded by working women, and we sometimes tend to forget that. Her mother was a working woman. Her mother engaged in social work and was active in lots of reform movement activities. Louisa also spent time around, sometimes in contentious ways, but also knew her socially. Elizabeth Peabody, who was an educator, an author, and a publisher. And she also knew Margaret Fuller, who was an author, a journalist, and one of the first women foreign correspondents in the history of American newspapers. And she knew Sarah Alden Bradford Ripley in Concord, who was a tutor and a translator of foreign languages. And many of the young men who were admitted to Harvard had actually gone to Sarah Alden Bradford Ripley for tutoring in their Greek and Latin studies in order to pass the entrance exams. And so Louisa was aware that there were lots of women who were out there doing work. But sometimes that work wasn't always as noticeable. And so throughout Louisa's fiction, women are also working. And they face lots of challenges. And some of these we see in Little Women. Others appear in some of her other novels, including Work and An Old-Fashioned Girl. But among those challenges that they face are poor wages, exploitation, both in terms of the hours that they're expected to work and sometimes the kinds of work that they're expected to do, and a general lack of respect from some of the people who employ them. They experience isolation in their work, and especially for seamstresses, and I do have an image here of a young woman working as a seamstress, but oftentimes work as a seamstress was done at home, and it was done as piecework. And so the young women who were doing that work often felt very isolated because they were not part of a boarding house or part of a factory workroom where they would be interacting often with others. They also at times felt that they were going against popular norms and the domestic ideology of the 19th century when they were working outside the home. And yet for most of these young women, that work was a necessity. The income that they brought in was not only to buy things for themselves, but often really to help support their families. And Louisa herself often felt driven even to do much of her writing as a means of raising funds to help support her family. And so one of the motivations to work for many of these women was not just self-support, but also support of their family. Others looked to develop their personal talents, and we see that within Little Women, both in terms of Jo's choice to pursue writing and then Amy's desire to be an artist. A number of figures in Alcott's fiction also engage in service work and efforts for social change. And I have to say, they also, at many times, and this comes up in fact in Little Women, and Marmee sometimes even gives voice to this sentiment, they sort of modeled that old New England Puritan distrust of idleness. You know, too much leisure gets you into trouble. And some of you may know that in colonial Massachusetts, at least, there were actually laws on the books in the early decades that any woman or child who was not involved in doing other work should be spinning yarn or flax to be able to produce fabric, because there was such a shortage of it. And so the idea that anyone might be sitting around doing nothing was just too dangerous to contemplate. And so when we look at the different kinds of work that women are doing in Little Women and also in some of Alcott's other fiction, we see things really in, I think, 3 different categories. One of those is the work of the domestic sphere. And this is the work that is most often what I tend to think of as the invisible work. And yet, if you look closely at many of the chapters of Little Women, we see that work going on. The cooking, the cleaning, the sewing, the gathering of foodstuffs, the preserving of foodstuffs. And part of what Alcott gives us a picture of is what it takes to run a household. And it's not an easy job. As Hannah, their domestic, says at one point, housekeeping ain't no joke. And she means it. And so there is a way that in the novel we see how order and planning and the coordination of efforts is crucial to being able to keep a household running. And as Anne knows, one of my favorite chapters in Little Women is the chapter Experiments, when Marmee decides to let the girls have their week of leisure and do as they please. And she even takes off for a whole day and lets the household descend into almost total chaos. And we see Jo's attempts at cooking and discovering that it takes more to prepare a palatable meal than simply coming home with a basket full of random items in an attempt to assemble supper. But we also are given a chance to see the importance of domestic help in those 19th century households. Even a household of modest means often had at least some hired domestic help, some individuals who lived in, others who came in and did day work, because one of the things those women had to do was haul water into their houses often. And we forget what a chore that can be when you have to haul water into the house 20 or 30 times a day to do all of the things that we take for granted when we turn the tap and there it is. Louisa also draws on some of her own experience, not only in Little Women, but also in work, in looking at the experiences of young women who go out to do domestic service. And she found it herself a harsh and difficult job and presents it that way in some of her work. She also gives us pictures of what we might think of as bridge occupations, those that exist between the private sphere of the home and employment outside the home. And among those, I've included in my list the role of governess or tutor, and we see Meg functioning in that role in Little Women, and sometimes complaining about the challenges of keeping a group of young children somewhat under her control and attempting to teach them something. We see the role of companion secretary, which Jo plays for Aunt March early on. And we also see at least mention of the work of seamstresses, although it's often the sisters themselves who take on the work of sewing for other family members as opposed to hiring someone to come in to do it. And then we see the public work that goes on, the work of women as teachers and as social workers, including Marmee's work within the novel and the way that she not only herself is reaching out to those in need, but encouraging her daughters to do the same thing. Authorship is something that I think of as a public role, but in chatting with my colleagues a bit, I will admit that it's sometimes also one of those bridge professions, because although women's names were sometimes on their work, other times they're publishing under pseudonyms, and it was work that they could do at home and send into a publisher. And then we have the factory work that women during the time period were engaging in, and even if Louisa wasn't herself an enthusiast for it, it often provided at least some women with opportunities not only to earn money for their family, but for a few of them to save enough money to put themselves through college. And a few of the young women who worked in the factories of New England saved their money and put themselves through school at places like Oberlin that were beginning to allow women not only to study, but eventually to take their degrees. And so that part, I think, might have made Louisa feel a little better about that work. One of the other things that I would like to give Louisa credit for is that she was interested in trying to create common ground among working women. And one of the endeavors that she helped to support in the Boston area, which we don't actually see in her fiction, but is recorded in her letters and in some of the biographical material written about her, was her willingness to support the development of the Women's Educational and Industrial Union. And I just have a sketch of the building in Boston. This was on Boylston Street. It opened in 1877. And it was a place for working women to come to be able to share companionship, to take classes, to improve their skills, to venture into professions that were not at the time readily open to women. And in fact, it provided some of the same services that we later associate with the settlement house movement, but it predates the establishment of Hull House by almost 12 years. And so I think Louisa deserves a lot of credit for wanting to think about a place where women from all different working fields could come together and support each other and sustain each other and help each other grow and develop as they pursued their different avenues in life. And so I wanted to sort of highlight the fact that she was really committed to seeing women succeed in their working lives, whether it was as authors or in some of the other ordinary occupations that those women pursued. And I'll turn things over to you.
Great. Well, I'm so excited to be sitting here with all of these people whose work has been so important to mine, and to talk about Little Women. I did read Little Women as a child, but I was thinking about this. Many of us who come to Little Women as a child reader are given a copy by a mother, aunt, grandmother. This was not the case with me. My mom's family didn't read. My mom is a reader now, but I got my copy of Little Women from the library after my best friend in the 3rd grade read Little Women because her mom passed it on to her. And so I didn't love it, that first reading, but it stuck with me. I read it again in college, and then in graduate school, and through a strange turn of events, I ended up writing a Louisa May Alcott dissertation, so I have had lots of time to read this book many times and to appreciate it. Okay, so I'm assuming that many of you in this room love Little Women. Maybe you've read it more than once. Maybe you have different versions of the novel in your home. Maybe you've seen some of the many adaptations that exist, either on the stage or in the film productions. And I think all of these attest to what all of the other panelists have said, the power of this novel that is celebrating its 150th birthday right now and continues to be relevant to us in so many ways. So it was culturally a very important work. I would say it's revolutionary. And we know it's revolutionary because it changed American literary fiction, or even literary fiction in general, women's fiction, children's fiction. But I think it's also revolutionary within the scope of our social and political being. And so what I'm going to talk about today are the ways that Little Women has engaged with some of the social and political movements over history. And I'm going to start with what is no one's favorite movement. And before I get to temperance, I should say that, of course, the most important movement we should be talking about when we're thinking about Little Women is abolition, right? Obviously, the novel was written in the period where this would be the conversation that everyone cared about. There are much more accomplished scholars who have done excellent work in talking about abolition, and you can find that in many places. So I'm going to talk about some of these less popular movements that are specifically connected as well to women's movements and women's lives. So, temperance, not a particularly popular movement. Some would even say a failed movement. If you look at these women, I don't really want to be BFFs with them. And yet, temperance was an important movement in the 19th century, and it was an important movement to the Alcotts. And I would like to offer us the idea that thinking about temperance, talking about temperance, gave women a way to talk about very serious issues like harmony in the home and domestic violence. And so we shouldn't ignore the importance of this movement either in the novel or in our history. And you may remember that at Meg's wedding, she extracts from Laurie a promise. She makes the temperance pledge and says, I won't drink for the rest of my life. And Alcott's very specific about how important this was to him. She says, Laurie thanked the March Girls for this all his life. It made him a happier and better person. So moving on to a movement that was a little bit later, women's suffrage. Alcott, of course, would not live to get to see women voting in national elections in this country. She would have had to make it till 1920 for that. However, she was always a promoter of women's suffrage, and in 1880, she did vote in the local school committee election in Concord, Massachusetts. You'll also see voting is something that is important to the March Girls and Little Women. Do you remember when Laurie wants to join the Pickwick Club and their society? How did they decide if he gets to join? Well, I mean, there's some discussion and some debate, but ultimately the girls hold a vote. And so they are practicing women's suffrage in their own level of civil government. Moving on, civil rights. The civil rights movement, of course, encompasses so many things and so many goals, produced many changes, culminating, of course, or maybe beginning, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prevents discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It's not specifically a women's movement, yet we can't think about women's movements without also thinking about civil rights. My focus today would be on integration and integration of education, which was something that was important to Alcott, and it's important to the March Girls as well. Do you remember in the last 3 pages of Little Women, there is a mention of a quadroon. When Joe and Professor Bear start their school, the Beargarten, they admit a merry little quadroon who could not be taken in elsewhere, but who was welcome to the Beargarten, though some people predicted that his admission would ruin the school. And so Plumfield was an integrated school. Wow. This figure is clearly based on Susan Robinson, the African-American student who was admitted to Alcott's father's school. And again, there was a lot of concern over whether that would be appropriate or would ruin the school. So Alcott was really ahead of the curve here in discussions of integrated education. This is 85 years before Brown versus the Board of Education and 95 years before the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Finally, the women's movement. We sometimes call it women's liberation or feminism. duh, right? This is all over Little Women. And of course, it's something that Alcott wants to advance. She shows women and girls finding their own empowerment and satisfaction through their writing, through their art, through their relationships with others, the way they structure domestic activities, even in the way they're thinking about marriage as a partnership. Also, Alcott anticipates discussions of women's pleasures and fulfillment. When I teach Little Women, I like to ask my students if they've enjoyed the sex scene. Now, this is a subtle but important scene of intimacy and pleasure. After Meg and John have a discussion about finances, Alcott carefully includes a moment where Meg puts on John's coat. The coat that he is only able to buy because she returns the dress and they have enough money to do this. She puts on the coat, welcomes him home, kind of racy, and if we might have missed it, what comes next is a blissful state of things. And so, so she's engaging with ideas of pleasure. Again, I think really a nice thing to remember that in 1868, 1869, Louisa May Alcott is thinking about these. Finally, I'd like to connect Little Women to a very, very recent movement, the Metoo Movement. This was originated by Tarana Bark. Early in this century, it went viral in 2017, and women all over the world have been sharing their stories of sexual harassment and sexual assault. Now, I'm not saying that Little Women is a narrative that's maybe directly engaging with sexual assaults, right? That's not going on there. But Alcott does actually deal with that in some of her other works, such as How I Went Out to Service or Work. There's just a piece by Harriet Ryson. But what she does in Little Women is she sets the stage for the Me Too movement that we are experiencing right now by saying that women's stories matter. Girls matter. They have things to say, and we will listen. And for 150 years, we have been listening to those stories and enjoying and appreciating and thinking about how much they do matter.
That's awesome. All right. Okay, so we want to finish by showing you a trailer for yet another film that's coming out. And it is, there's a new film adaptation of Little Women that's set in our present time. So here's the trailer for it.
I want to write something that won't be forgotten after I die.
You will. I know it.
And it's definitely a pass for me.
It's a pass for me as well.
Me too, sweetie.
Thank you.
I just don't think I can compete. You're the best writer I know.
You don't get out much.
There's no shame in changing your mind. You're still youngish.
Professor Bear, I need to talk to you.
I'd be happy to read more of your novel.
You would? I have been wanting anyone to read it.
It's not quite ready.
Am I a hopeless case?
Maybe it's time to take a break from this one.
I've been working on this for 10 years.
Exactly why it might be helpful to try working on something else.
When do I stop feeling like this?
You're a writer. Don't you want your story to be unexpected?
You are far more interesting than what you write. I want to be reading more of you.
I am not interesting. There he is again.
So you're the infamous Lawrence grandson.
Lori.
Call me Marmee. That's Beth.
Ew. Amy.
I'm Meg.
We come into this world perfect. We'll go through all these stages of learning and shifting and changing, breaking, even when we become something far from perfect, but perfectly unique.
Will you hold on to me? Try to give a little love to you. Just enough to see us through.
Never stop doing what you love, ever.
Though the world keeps spinning round, I keep on.
Well, growing up, you have to deal with that.
I guess no matter how many drafts I send, he still reads them. So.
Oh, well, then he definitely has a crush on you.
All right.
You're my person. I guess broke, Marmy has Dad. Lori has Amy. I have you.
I, Joe March.
I, Elizabeth March.
I, Amy March.
I, Margaret March.
To always help each other reach our castles, no matter where they may be.
Go ahead. Close that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good enough. I think you've been a very patient audience. Do you need to like stretch just a little bit? Wiggle here a little bit. I think we have a little time for some questions. If you have any questions, if we haven't worn you out. Yes?
I noticed nobody mentioned Beth.
Yes.
I love Beth, and I think she's really important. Yes, a question about Beth? What about Beth?
No, I was just curious that nobody mentioned her, because when I read it, she was a big part for me.
There are some critics who say really nasty things about her, about basically they're glad she's dead and she was boring. I totally disagree with those. Greg, take it.
Well, no, one thing, true life confession, it's hard for me to talk about Beth because I get choked up. Like, I find this part of the story genuinely moving, and every time I read it, it gets me. And I'm not the only one. Did you ever see that episode of Friends when Joey reads well, he has the same reaction. So it's hard to talk about, but I think it's super important. One of the great conversations we had, and if you want to jump in here, is that we've noticed that our students seem increasingly interested in Beth. When I first taught this, I was blinded by Joe. I thought like everybody loved Joe, and Joe was the reason you read the book. Then I learned no, it's the all four sisters. But I mean, is that your experience that Beth is seemingly very, very interesting to millennials?
There's an online. It's a combination of vlogs, Tumblr entries that the girls supposedly have written. Twitter feeds, all this kind of stuff that's built together into this thing called the March Family Letters. And it's really, really interesting. But what was fascinating about it is that the character of Beth seemed to resonate the most with the audience that was watching that online. And she would play songs, and there would be like the lyrics for her songs in one of the Tumblrs. And I mean, and also she talked about social anxiety disorder, and that incredibly resonated with people. I mean, the stuff that she put on her Tumblr got republished by more people than a lot of the other Tumblr entries that the characters were producing. I think she's in her moment somehow, that what she experiences is something that a lot of young people today are experiencing, and a lot of readers today of whatever age are experiencing and learning how to talk about, and that she's incredibly relevant. So thank you for that great question.
I think that BBC production that was just on spent more time on Beth than any production I've ever seen. Really, and with the social anxiety stuff, how many times, like 4 times she goes over to the Lawrences, and Marmy's always saying, you gotta do this, you gotta do this. But
she has a lot more dialogue.
Yes, they really spend a lot of time with
And in
her.
that production and in the March Family Letters, the setup for that is that Marmy is in the Canadian military and she's been deployed overseas, and so the girls are doing the video logs for her as the letters to her. But so Beth gets to say a lot of the things that Marmy would have said if she'd been there in that production, and that was true for this last production as well, that she becomes the mouthpiece for a lot of those truths that Marmy would have otherwise shared. Yes?
There's a recent novel by a prominent woman writer called, I think, simply March.
Yes.
And it's about the father, and I haven't read it, but I wondered, is it worth reading?
A question about Geraldine Brooks's March. Who wants to field that one? Go, Greg, go.
It's a Pulitzer Prize winning novel, right? It was, or a National Book Award? It's an award-winning novel. It is. She's a great writer. I don't like the book. I think part of it is feeling so, and I don't want to, it's the Mr. March in there isn't really like Bronson. He has an affair. Bronson's not really an affair guy, and who knows, right? But I'm not a fan of the book, but are there?
I kind of am.
Yeah.
Go.
So yeah, Absolutely. What it does is if you read March, you will never read Little Women again in the same way. So you kind of have to give up, because suddenly you get this new characterization of a character who doesn't get many lines in the novel, and he's not probably what you would imagine him to be doing. As Greg mentioned, I don't know that I find what happens to him completely plausible, but I think Geraldine Brooks's way of negotiating with the fears and anxieties that are wrapped up in having Dad away from the house in the war is worth thinking about it. So I'd recommend reading it.
And it's fiction. I mean, I don't really like that argument when people say, well, that's not how Bronson Alcott really was. And that's kind of how I feel, but I don't know if that's a good argument.
Thank you.
In the back.
When you read Eden's Outcasts, it talks about animal rights and stuff. The question was, Louisa May Alcott going around productively, so when she went to Boston, did she become a meat eater, for example, or was she really into the animals' rights, except for milk, I guess, which Bronson had?
I'm having a little trouble hearing all of your question. I know it's about Eden's Outcasts, but I need a little more.
Vegetarian.
Okay.
Vegetarianism.
Okay.
Louisa May Alcott go willingly with her dad on his vegan principles, or did she change when she was living alone in Boston, for example?
Please restate the question.
Okay, so one of Bronson Alcott's beliefs was that we should not be eating flesh, animal flesh. But Louisa's mother, Abba, liked meat and felt that they should occasionally eat meat. And when she offered and had meat to offer, Louisa partook. And so I don't think that Louisa embraced that belief in the way that her father did. I think she also wiggles a little on temperance. Other questions? Yes?
Why did Louisa herself have pseudonyms?
Okay. Why pseudonyms for Louisa? Why A.M. Barnard?
Do you mean A.M. Barnard? Because she didn't want people to know that she was the author of those particular stories. They were pretty wild for somebody who was a proper Concordian. And actually a lot of the people that wrote those things for the story papers did not append their own names to it. Some of them were published anonymously and some of them pseudonymously. But I don't think none of her children's things or her adult novels were ever. She had the no name thing,
yes.
Whatever. It's it is sort of a thriller, but there was a publisher had a series, and they got well-known writers to write things that they published without their names, and then everybody played this game of guess who wrote this. And so she did one for them, but
and that was 1877, and they didn't guess it was hers, which is pretty awesome.
What I would add to that is that about the time she's writing this thriller, she's also working on her first novel called Moods, which I consider a very ambitious kind of, it's a transcendentalist novel, and there's not a lot of transcendentalist fiction, and so this is an ambitious project that she's trying to do, and I think she's trying to earn the respect of
be a respectable writer.
Right, and the thrillers that she was publishing with murder and drug use and cross-dressing, that wasn't respectable.
There's a question in the back row.
But it paid.
But it paid, yeah.
This is not a question, this is a comment, but I'm listening to Little Women on LibriVox right now, and I find it to be a deeply Christian novel, and there are a lot of biblical references in it, and I think that makes it such the rich novel that it is. And
I feel like
Greg
this is my favorite topic.
Go.
The 19th century is fascinating Because it's this amazing moment in American history they're called the Second Great Awakening. But Americans all over the place start inventing their own religions. The Latter-day Saints might be an example that people are familiar with that still exists today, has millions of followers. I think in 1840, Transcendentalism would have looked like one of these new American religions. The Alcott family is Unitarian, but the Unitarians and the Transcendentalists don't see, I think that Alcott's own feeling, and then a lot of the Transcendentalists, were that the Unitarians it wasn't very spiritual, right? It was about doing good works and going to church and being respectable, but what about miracles? And a lot of, whether it's Thoreau or Emerson or Whitman or Alcott, they're interested, I think, in miracles and this kind of spiritual. With that said, I do think there are definitely these Christian elements. Pilgrim's Progress, the New Testament, the greatest life ever lived, reference to Jesus, it's indirect. On the other hand, I don't know that Alcott's very orthodox.
They don't go to church, ever.
Yeah, they do.
He's supposed to be, what, a chaplain in the war, but they never go to church. She gets married at home, which people did, but they don't even go to church for the wedding. And actually, when the book came out, you remember what they did on Christmas Day, for example, the bloody theatricals, right? That the Ladies' Repository commented in their review of Little Women that this book should not be read on Sundays.
So at the same time, they were practicing Christianity, because what did the girls do on Christmas Day but take their breakfast to the people in town, the poor family, and for which they were rewarded. So Christianity, certainly, as they've said, for Louisa May Alcott, was practiced at home and with your neighbors and living the life that Christ professed. It had nothing to do with going to church.
Her phrase, which was big in the 19th century, was practical Christianity.
That's Theodore Parker, who was a Unitarian minister and a great hero of hers. The Transcendentalists, many of them were fallen away Unitarians, right?
Exactly.
They cut their ties, but Theodore Parker did not, and she admired him greatly. But she also said that she believed in Buddhism, that she thought that maybe that she thought at times that she had lived before, for example. She writes things like that in her journal. So
she was interested in Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science.
It's deeply spiritual. Christian is a different kind. Practical Christianity is a better.
I mean, she quotes the Bible throughout.
Yep.
Thank you for, one last question, yes.
The panel had mentioned that Alcott did perhaps ponder whether or not to have Joe marry. So my question to you is, would there have been a Plumfield Academy if Joe had been a spinster and then the follow-up Little Men and Joe's Boys? What would have happened had she been a spinster?
Alcott hated teaching, so she would have had to hire somebody to do the teaching. And it's her money, right? March leaves her the money for it, but she didn't want to be the teacher.
One thing to sort of disagree with you on that you said Amy gets, I think you're the person who said Amy gets everything. But my feeling always was, I felt sorry for Amy because I felt that Lori really still loved Joe.
And there are those moments where Joe and Lori look at each other across the room, and you realize like the flame is still burning. Like,
And I have to say about that, so when Louisa went to Europe in 1866, she went as a companion to an invalid, and she met this young man from Poland and really fell for him. And she said in some of her letters and comments later that, every young man in Concord wants to believe that he was the inspiration for Lori and Little Women. But it's this young man from Poland that she met that really won her heart. And she that when she stopped being the companion, she got to spend a few weeks in Paris, and he met her there. And we don't know what happened at that point. But it's the place that she actually went back and she erased in her journal what she said and said, well, it couldn't be. And she scratched it so thin that there's like a hole on that page in her journal, and she didn't do that other places. And I really think that Little Women is still so powerful for so many readers, partly because her passion, her experience, her personal experience is woven into that relationship between Jo and Laurie in the book. And so in some ways, the thing about, publishers are very perverse, and they're, forcing me to make Jo marry somebody, but I've made a funny match for her. I mean, everybody quotes that line from her journal all the time. And it's like, oh, she never would have done it by herself, but she knew what it was to love somebody that much. And she couldn't help putting that into her book. And I think the books that frustrate us and that we have to wrestle with are the ones that stay with us the longest. And I really think that's at the heart of what this book is doing, that we still are wrestling with. So, thank you for your questions. Thank you. And on behalf of the panelists, I want to thank our friends at the Walnut Creek Public Library. We're so honored that you wanted to put this program on, and they've been the best hosts ever, and so thank you very, very much for having us. Thank
you. Well, thank you to our panelists for being here. We are so grateful that in addition to their trip to San Francisco, they took Bart out to Walnut Creek to be with us this evening. We're so thankful for you being here with us this evening. And for all of you who have attended, we hope to see you at the next Live from the Library program. It's on Wednesday, June 20th, and it is called For Singing Out Loud, and it's an evening with festival opera. So we hope to see you back at the library in June. Thank you so much.
Thank you.